Located in East Africa, Eritrea is home to somewhere between 3.6 to 6.7 million people. Getting an accurate head count is a little tricky here as the country has never actually conducted an official government census. Anyway, of that number, about 2,500 people live on a grouping of more than 100 islands in Eritrea's northern Red Sea region known as the Dahlak Archipelago. However, only a few of these islands are inhabited on a permanent basis, such as Dahlak Kabir, Nora, and Dohul, sometimes also called Dahil. Most of these people maintain a traditional lifestyle, fishing or herding goats and camel. The overwhelming majority are ethnically Tigray and or Afar peoples who speak an endangered Afro-Asiatic language called Dahlak exclusive to the archipelago. That being said, most Dahlak Islanders are bilingual and can speak Arabic or Afar in addition to Dahlak. And in part, this speaks to the archipelago's more cosmopolitan history, being one of the first places in the Horn of Africa to embrace Islam. Long before the arrival of Islam in the 7th century, there is evidence on the Dahlak Archipelago of settlement from the African mainland, including the ruins of a 4th century Christian church and Aksumite coins. However, in 702 AD, the islands were predominantly Muslim and later conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate, which designated them as a place of exile. This practice continued under the Abbasid Caliphate, which succeeded the Umayyads in 750 AD. However, by the 9th century, Dahlak was again under the control of the Kingdom of Aksum. Around 900 AD, a treaty of friendship was concluded with the Najahid Dynasty, which ruled over southwestern Yemen. And, by the 10th century, a quasi-autonomous Dahlak paid a tribute of amber, panther skins, tortoise shells, pearls, and slaves from various sources on the African mainland to Sultan Ishaq ibn Ibrahim. Aksumite control over the archipelago continued to wane, and in 960 AD, the Sultanate of Dahlak emerged. Meanwhile, over in Yemen, there was an emerging power struggle between a Sana-based dynasty and enslaved soldiers of African origin called the Najahids. Enslaved soldiers or Mamluks, meaning one who is owned, were a key component in armies of the Islamic world, and their presence in Yemen is attested to as early as the 1st millennium AD. In part, these slave soldiers were favored for their neutrality in domestic political affairs, though many did eventually gain tremendous influence and power, even establishing independent Mamluk dynasties. Military slaves of African origin were, however, somewhat rare in the Islamic world outside Africa itself. That being said, Abyssinians, a catch-all term used in medieval Arabia for people from the Horn of Africa, not necessarily confined to Ethiopia, initially made up the bulk of enslaved soldiers during the Najahid Dynasty. African slaves were nonetheless largely replaced by Circassian and Turkish ones in the later Ayyubid, Rasulid, and Tahirid dynasties. Anyway, without diving too deeply into the conflict, the Najahid dynasty, centered around the city of Zabid, collapsed following invasion by the Yufrid dynasty. In wake of this, an Abyssinian slave soldier named Naja proclaimed himself sultan in 1022 and soon controlled the coastal regions of southwestern Yemen. The upstart Najahid dynasty was later recognized by the Abbasid Caliph, but still its rule was contested by the Sulayhid dynasty based in Sana'a. In 1060, Najah was assassinated by poisoning, and the Sulayhids occupied Zabid. Najah's two sons, alongside a number of other prominent Najahids, then fled to the Dahlak Archipelago. This benefited the Sultanate as the Najahid later emerged victorious and extended what basically was a favorable trade status to Dahlak. This resulted in the islands becoming an important stopover point for long-distance maritime trade between Fatimid Egypt and the Western Indian Ocean. In turn, this allowed the Sultanate to have a monopoly over external trade of the Ethiopian interior. Aside from the archipelago itself, the Sultanate also controlled a number of coastal settlements, most notably the port city of Massawa, which was governed by a deputy titled the Naib. To the Ethiopians, the Sultan of Dahlak was known as the Prefect of the Sea, in contrast to the Lord of the Sea from Medri Bari, who ruled over the Central Highlands or Kabasa of Eritrea. However, when the Zagwe dynasty, a medieval Agao monarchy which then ruled over parts of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, shifted its trade routes south to Zela, a port city now found in western Abdal region of the unrecognized Republic of Somaliland, Dahlak lost its monopoly. The political relationship between Dahlak and the Najahids was unclear, but it likely was more direct than with the Najahid Dynasty. Nevertheless, following a devastating series of raids in the early 14th century, the Sultanate became a tributary of the Ethiopian Empire in 1464 or 1465 and was forced to pay annual tribute. The archipelago sank further into decline by the early 16th century when the Portuguese arrived and briefly occupied it during a conflict with the Ottoman Empire. That being said, Dahlak would later join the Adal Sultanate and the Ottoman Empire during their conquest of Abyssinia, and for this was gifted the port of Arquico. In 1541, however, the Portuguese once again raided the archipelago, and then in 1557 the Ottoman Empire occupied Dahlak, making it part of the Habesh Eyalet. The islands gradually declined in importance during Ottoman rule, being described as little more than a modest collection of villages in the 18th century. Following this, the Dahlak Archipelago became a part of the Italian colony of Eritrea when it was formed on January 1, 1890. That being said, Rome did little with the islands aside from building the Nokra prison camp. This facility housed political prisoners and was used during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, which saw Ethiopia occupied by Italy. The camp was later dismantled in 1941 after British forces occupied the islands following the Battle of Keren. Eritrea was then federated and later annexed by Ethiopia, which, following the rise of a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship known as the Derg, meaning committee or council, in Amharic, the Dahlak Archipelago became home to a Soviet naval base and possibly even an intelligence facility. It's not exactly clear, but after they were expelled from Somalia in 1977 for siding with Ethiopia, Soviet personnel moved a dry dock they had operated at Berabera to Asab and later positioned it off the coast in the Dahlak Archipelago. Ethiopia, or more specifically the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, later lost control of the islands in 1990 during the Eritrean War of Liberation. And then, in May 1991, the PDRE collapsed when rebels captured Addis Ababa. Now a de facto independent country, Eritrea began peace talks with the newly established transitional government in Ethiopia. And following a referendum, Eritrea became Africa's newest country on May 28, 1993. Today, the Dahlak Archipelago is part of Eritrea's northern Red Sea region, and while not always open to tourism, has emerged as a popular spot for scuba diving. It is also home to the Dahlak Marine National Park, which includes parts of the archipelago and surrounding waters. Anyway, I'm going to give the Dahlak Archipelago a 1 on the Ghost Countries Index. Despite its rather interesting history, I don't really see much happening there in the near future. But as always, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Also, a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon, and if you'd like to help support the channel too, there's a link in the description down below.